So two bones join together at a movable joint, and a muscle is attached to those two bones. It spans that joint, and when it contracts, one of those bones move more relative to the other. The muscle attachment point that is more stable is referred to as the origin and is more medial or more proximal, and the more movable insertion is more lateral or more distal. So you'll have an idea of these attachment points, and those attachment points are going to determine whether a muscle spans the anterior surface of a joint or the posterior surface of a joint, or the medial or the lateral surface of a joint. Now, once you know this, you're going to be able to reasonably guess the action of that muscle rather than memorizing them all. So your origins and insertions are directly related to those actions, and you're going to want to learn them all at the same time. Here's another example. Here's your eyeball, right? This muscle is coming out of the back of your eye socket. It originates right on your bone right here, and then it's actually kind of inserts into the sclera of your eye, the connective tissue right there. There's no bone in your eye, but when this contracts, right, it's going to pull, because it's on this side of the eyeball right here. When it contracts, it's going to pull your eyeball to one side or the other. All right, so the general rule, no matter where we're looking, is going to be the same. Muscles are going to contract, and they're going to pull the two things that they're attached to closer together in some fashion. So again, here we're looking at those muscles that aren't spanning a joint, like that eyeball right there. And they're originating on here, they're spanning out here, and they're pretty much a direct pull, right? Your lips are going to move back toward there, and your scapula maybe will move back kind of toward the axial region. But for most of our bones that we're going to look at, most of the muscles, sorry, we're going to look at, they're going to be going around this fulcrum kind of thing, where when you contract your biceps brachii, it's not like your ulnar and your radius like crush up against your fulnar, go straight forward. Like they're designed to like move around this pivot point and have this movement right here, right? So this gets a little more complicated. They are moving things closer together when they contract, but the movement is not so straightforward as like your risorius there. Here's an example right here. This is a joint kind of thing of this machine right here. And you got this piston right here, right? So if you watch it, piston's bringing it in and it's causing this movement. It's not exactly the same as a muscle, not at all, in fact. Pushing out causes it moved in, pulling it back out. Right, so it's moving around that joint and causing these complex movements right here. So here again, here's our biceps brachii. It's spanning, in this case, it's spanning your shoulder joint, spanning your elbow joint. And if I want to move, right? If I want to, let's say I'm standing in anatomical position. I want to move my forearm upwards, closer to that. What do I got to do here with my biceps? All I got to do is contract, right? And it's going to pull that up there. Now my arm is stuck in that flex position up toward there, and I want to move it back down toward anatomical position. What do I do? How can I do it? Do I have this muscle just push it back? Right? It's going to push back on the radial bone, and then that elbow or your radial and your ulnar will move back in this direction. Am I right? Wrong. See that? That's wrong. It doesn't do that. What does muscle do? Exactly. It pulls. It only pulls. It contracts. It creates a pulling force. So as you can see, the way to get your arm back down to anatomical position is just to let gravity flop down on your arm again and put it there, right?
You're actually wrong.
He's actually wrong. Yes, I am. I forgot. You have a muscle on the other side. This muscle that's spanning the opposite side of the joint is going to create a pulling force when we want to extend this muscle. Now, the truth is, when I'm standing upright and I want to extend my elbow and I want to bring it back down to anatomical position, it is pretty much gravity. This one isn't working too much. But you could think of doing dips or something like that where you're extending it against the force, and then you could start to feel that muscle move. All right, so the great thing about this section is if you forget what something does, you just place your hand on that muscle and make a movement and see what happens, right? Which muscle is contracting? And then if there's a muscle contracting on this side, this muscle is going to be being stretched, right? But for any joint, if you have movement in both planes right here, you have to have a muscle that is spanning each side of that joint, okay? And so the terms for these movements that we just talked about here, in this case, when I move the arm closer, when I bring the forearm, right, from anatomical position, like closer to my body right there, that's a movement called flexion. And it's not just flexion, it's flexion at the elbow. When I bring it back toward anatomical position, that's called extension at the elbow, right? Because this is where the action is taking place. So this is bringing us into muscle action right here. We learned about origins, insertions, M-O-I-A, muscles, origins, insertions, actions. This is the A part of what we're learning here. So let's go back to this eyeball. Here's the eyeball. If you want to look up, this muscle contracts. You want to look down, this muscle contracts. You want to look sideways, this one, right? You've got a muscle spanning every single way this eye can move, right? Because muscle is only going to pull. That's what it does. So this is the design of the eyeball right there. If we were the Terminator, right, you could just have one thing moving back and forth, but that's not the way muscles work. So for these terms, right, flexion, extension, right, you have to have a muscle on each side contracting on either side of the joint to cause each particular movement. So when we talk about these actions, you could talk about them in a couple ways. The correct term is not flexion right here, but this can be called flexion of the forearm. This can be called flexion at the elbow. This could be called flexion of the forearm at the elbow if you really want to be sure. This is the easiest thing to say for me, right? But whatever you're most comfortable with. So you can use any of these terms, but that is the muscle action of this brachialis muscle right here. All right. So again, here biceps, this is what we were just talking about here, right? Flex, 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 flex. Oops, triceps extend. Pronate or pronates, what's that? We don't know yet, right? But these are all the kind of things you got to know right there. We'll go over some major points that may be meaningful to this over here. All right, so there's a couple different types of joints, and they're going to come up in our major, like the elbow, shoulder, knee joint that we're going to talk about, hip joint. So one of these is called a hinge joint, and this is basically like the hinge of your door, right? It moves in basically one plane. Right, so this is a hinge joint. This is your elbow joint. When this muscle contracts, you can't really do too much except for move in an anterior posterior direction with this elbow joint. Right. Same thing with your knee, a little bit, is basically a hinge joint. When you flex at the knee, your knee goes back right there. It's basically acting like that hinge on a door. Same thing with your temporal mandibular joint. When you open and close, it's basically operating as a hinge joint. These are called modified because they can do slight side-to-side movement. So they can do that, but they mostly, for the most part, operate as this hinge joint here. The other major one is this ball and socket joints right here. And this will be your shoulder and hip joints right here. These ones are very movable. Those hinge joints, for the most part, we're moving in one plane, anterior, posterior, maybe medial, lateral, but these ones are going to be moving all over the place, right? You think of it right now, you could take your arm right there and do twirls with them and everything like that. They can move in medial, lateral, superior, inferior. They can move in anterior, posterior. Right? They can move in all things because the way they're constructed right here. So they're moving in all these different planes, right? Here's your ball and socket joint. Here's your humerus fitting into the glenoid fossa. Here's your femoral head fitting into your acetabulum. And remember I said like that eyeball, you had muscles kind of spanning on each side of that joint. We're going to see this with these two joints too. You're going to have muscles spanning the anterior surface, the posterior, the medial, the lateral, because it's going to move in all those different planes. The other kind of one we come into occasionally is this pivot joint right here. This is moving in just one plane. Remember your radial head fitting into your radial notch right there of the ulnar. And what you didn't see is this little annular ligament. It's kind of secured around there like that. when muscles pull it this way or that, it's going to kind of pivot around there. And we'll see. You're also on your head, your atlantoaxial joint, right? That's making you shake your head no, right? When it spins around right there. That's also that. In the dens, if you remember that, the dens, that had a little ligament kind of that looked like that. So those are pivot joints. For all these angular movements, these are kind of thing when we describe the action of a particular muscle, right? These are the movements that you would have to think about when you're describing these, right? Here's a couple points on these. When you're considering any sort of movement, you're going to start in anatomical position, right? And again, remember the key thing about that, you're just basically standing upright with your feet facing forward, your palms are facing forward. That means your anterior forearm here is facing anterior, right? This will be important because there's all these there's all these muscles here on the anterior surface, and they're on the anterior surface because you're in anatomical position, right? Same thing with your right down here, right? You're standing up straight. So all these movements, as well as the actions they describe, are going to be considered from anatomical position. So one way to think of it, when you're in anatomical position, you're fully extended. Your arms are basically at your side. They're not causing any, there's no sort of angle between your body and your limbs. There's no angle between the two parts of your limbs right here. In contrast, when you're fully flexed, right? Someone in a fetal position is pretty much fully flexed right there. Everything's curled up in toward the body for the most part, right? So this is the easiest way for me to remember, like if you're thinking of a flexion or extension movement, right? Anatomical position, fetal position. So the other major term right here, in extended, he's in anatomical position. When you go beyond anatomical position, in the case of your arm and your leg right here, you're bringing it backwards in your body. This is called hyperextension. So there's another major movement because a lot of the movements like your glutes and your hamstrings, the extension, you don't really feel like you're doing anything. But once you go into hyperextension, you could feel the muscle of them right there. Right? So extension, hyperextension. And then flexion, again, is going to be moving, creating an angle right here. And for the upper part of your body, at least, you're moving in the anterior plane when you do that, right? But you're creating this angle that wasn't there before. Here's another picture of a hyperextension, right? Her neck is going backwards. It's hyperextended. Both of her arms are hyperextended. Her spine is actually hyperextended, which we'll talk about in a minute. Her hips, right? Over here, she's flexing at the hip or thigh, and over here, her knee is. And even her feet, which we'll talk about in a minute, are going to be maybe hyperextended. Oh, they're just extended. All right, but she's in a fully hyperextended position. And again, when you're looking at exercise or trying to feel it on yourself or a close partner, right? When you're looking at them, trying to feel the action of these muscles, when you're just extended, you don't really feel your glutes or your hamstrings doing much, or when you're going back from a flexion to extension movement. But when you start hyperextending is when you're going to start to feel those muscles really contract. While I'm here, I want to point out that when you're doing this movement right here, she is hyperextending, right? And the gluteus maximus and hamstrings are the ones that are causing that action, right? They're doing that. They're the ones contracting. They're the ones that are causing this hyperextension movement. If there's muscles contracting on one side, the muscles on the other side of the leg are going to be stretching. So in this case, this guy is doing a major flexion movement, and those same muscles are being stretched right here. All right, so when you're looking at the action of a muscle, you could look at the exercise you would do for the action, but then you could also think of what's the opposite action? What would I do when I stretched it? Then it would be kind of the opposite action right there. So those movements are going in an anterior posterior direction. Okay? The other major movement that we'll see, and these really apply to your limbs only, actually, and your hands and fingers, right? Abduction, right here. If you're abducted by aliens, you're taken away, right? So abduction, taken away from the body. Here, your arm is leaving from anatomical position, out, away from your body. so is your leg. These are abduction movements. You're being abducted by aliens. For your wrist right here, around the wrist joint, remember you're in anatomical position right here. So abduction, she's moving her hand outwards, right? So even if your hand was up here somewhere on your belly button and you were doing this same exact movement, that's an abduction movement, right? Mental note. So this is abduction of the wrist. Your fingers would be moving away from each other. If you were doing abducting your fingers, that would be an abduction movement as well. And then, so this is movement in the medial lateral plane. You're moving laterally away from the body. For every action, there's another action. In this case, you want to add it back to your body. Adduction movements are going to bring these limbs back towards your body. Same thing with your hands, same thing with your fingers. Take your fingers, spread them out wide. That's an abduction movement. Put them back together, that's an adduction movement, right? So those are the two major ones, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. There's a couple of other types of movement, rotational movements, right? Your head rotation, that's pretty unique, only like one muscle here. There's also lateral rotation for your shoulder and your hip joints, right? These are happening around those ball and socket joints that can do these funky movements right here. If right now you take your arm, you put it out in anatomical position, you kind of move your shoulder in, so it does this movement without moving your elbow. That is medial rotation. So these in your hip are going to be all those like salsa and bachata movements right there that you might do with your hip. Right? A little less common, right? But that's happening at the shoulder joint. Nothing's happening at the elbow joint over here. And so another movement, supination and pronation right here. And this isn't at your elbow. Again, if you don't believe me, you put your hand on your medial epicondyle and do these pronation and supination movements. You feel that your humerus elbow joint isn't moving at all. This is happening around your proximal and distal radial ulnar joints right there. So remember that radial head kind of spinning around. That's what's happening here. All right, so the way you'll remember it is if you could hold a bowl of soup, then you're supinated. And then as you move your hand around to face downward, that's a pronation movement. There's a couple other ones, a little more kind of local ones for your feet, right? Eversion, inversion really correspond to abduction and adduction. Eversion, you're moving at the ankle, moving your feet outward. Abduction, moving in. The terms dorsiflexion and plantiflexion refer to movement at the feet, at the ankle, and in superior, inferior plane. Your feet are already at an angle, so the flexion extension movements are kind of hard to describe. So they call them dorsiflexion, and that's really a kind of an extension movement, as we'll see. And plantiflexion, plantar is kind of like your ballerina move right there, where your feet is moving like that. The way I remember it, dorsiflexion, think of a dorsal fin of a shark on the top of your foot moving towards your body right there. Lateral flexion, this is not abduction, adduction, because you're not really moving away from your body, you're just moving one side to the other. So if you're laterally flexing your neck right here, that's called lateral flexion. A couple weird ones, protraction and retraction, applies to your jaw as well as your scapula. And then depression and elevation is just opening and closing your jaw right there. This will also apply to your scapula, depression, elevation. All right, so this next section, we're going to look at the actions of muscles and how those actions can be inferred in general by the location around the joint. All right, see you next time.